Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. And this screen is the screen that you first get to when you log into the system. And it's going to list all of the clients that you added in. So for this webinar, I'm going to be taking you through a spouse client file from start to finish. And it's going to be a really open-ended session. So if you have any questions, feel free to just jump in and unmute yourself, or you can send it through the chat if that's easier. So to get started, you would just go up to this add button, and then you'd add in the first spouse's information. So the key things to add, you're going to need to put in first name and last name. You can put in the middle name as well, but it's optional, so you don't have to put it in. And then the email field is there if you want to send the client the online questionnaire. So you'd put in their email and you'd click this use questionnaire box. And then once you added them as a client, it would send off an email to them. It would say, click here to access your questionnaire. So they'd click on the link and then they'd have to create a password just so that their information stays secure and so that they don't have to complete the whole thing in one sitting. They can come back into it if they have more information to add.
A question.
Yep.
What's that field say spouse client? What's that for?
So the spouse client is if you are doing wills for both spouses and you want to link them together. So we'll get to that when we add the second spouse to the system.
Okay.
This is just when you're adding the first spouse, whether it's a single client or you're doing a spouse client file, you just add them normally. So first name, last name are really the key things. And then if you're sending the questionnaire, you'd put the email and you'd click the use questionnaire box. But you don't have to send them the questionnaire. So either you can send them whatever questionnaire you have now, if it's like a PDF or Word document, or you can just go through it in the system with them and you don't have to send it to them before. So it's up to you and your client on sort of how you want to deal with the file.
Is it like a secure way to share information for the client?
Usually, if the questionnaire doesn't work out, you can sort of do the same thing like that I'm doing now, and you could get on a screen share with them through Zoom and just go through it that way. I know that sometimes Jordy does that if the client hasn't filled out too much information on their questionnaire or if they're just not that tech savvy, especially in these days when you can't really meet with them in person. So he usually just does a screen share and then go through it like we're going to do today. And then the client would just share the information and Jordy would input it.
Ah,
Yeah. So that's a good way to do it. So there you've got a couple of different options there. And then the contributors thing down at the bottom, that's just if you've got multiple users on your account, you can sort of pick and choose who has access to certain files. So if everybody's been made an administrator, so when you're adding them as a user, you clicked the administrator box, they'll have access to all the files no matter what. But if they're not an administrator, they'll only have access to files that they're either a primary or secondary contributor on. And then whoever the primary contributor is on the file is whose name's going to appear on the cover page if you generate the will and you choose a cover page. So then we can just go and add Ben to the system. And then since we're doing a spouse client file today, this means we're doing wills for both spouses. So we need to add them both as separate clients in the system, and then we'll link them together using that spouse client function. So if you were just doing one spouse's will and the other spouse was a beneficiary, you would just need to add the one spouse and then you could add the other spouse to their family tree. But this is if you're doing wills for both of them. So we'll go ahead and add the second spouse. So we'll call her Lauren Collins. And then here's the key field, this spouse client. So you just click on it and then you pick the name of the first spouse. And so you can only do this when you're adding the second spouse to the system because the first spouse already has to be in the system in order to be able to select them from this list. So just when you're doing the second spouse, do this spouse client function. And then you can just go ahead and add. And so the spouse client function, what that does is it links them together so that any shared family tree or joint asset information will automatically populate in both of their profiles. And then the scenarios, the appointments, you've got the option to manually sync over information. So essentially copy a scenario over to the other spouse's profile so that you don't have to start from scratch and do it twice if it's going to be the same plan. So then you just pick a client to start with. So I'm going to start with Ben. So you just click on Ben's name and it brings us into his profile. And if you haven't sent the client the questionnaire or they haven't filled it out, you're just going to start with these two icons if it's a spouse client file and just the client icon if it's a single client. And what I usually do first is I edit the client's information. So to do that, you can just double click on the icon and it will bring up more information. And the key things for anyone on the family tree, you're going to want to make sure first name, last name, and gender are all in there, just so that the wording of the will comes out properly. You can leave the gender as unspecified if you want, but then we don't have a they option yet in the will, so it'll just say he or she throughout. So if you do know the gender, then you should put it in just so that it kind of eliminates the wording that you don't need. The also known as field, if Ben is also known as Benny Collins, you can type that in and that will populate in the will. The date of birth, you can pick it from this little calendar, but I find it easier to just type it in month, day, year. So 1956, and then it will automatically populate that age for you. For country, you can pick a country, you can pick citizenship, you can do multiple if there's multiple. And all of this other information, work address, occupation, that kind of stuff, is just for your file. So it doesn't really have an effect on the actual generation of the will, but it's good to have on your file. It's good information to have on the client. Then residency. Residency is important because however you set the province is going to be how the system calculates the probate tax throughout. And it's also going to be what precedent generates. So right now we have Ontario precedents, BC precedents, and Nova Scotia precedents. So if you're from BC or Nova Scotia, you're going to want to make sure that the residency is changed either to BC or Nova Scotia, so that when you go to generate the will, it's going to generate the proper precedent for your province. So that's a key field. City is also important. So if Ben's from the city of Toronto, I can type that field and that will populate in the will. We'll say Ben Collins of the city of Toronto. Special circumstances for the client is a place where you could note any potential capacity issues. So it's more for your records so that you have this information on file. You want it really well documented, especially if you think that there might be some sort of capacity challenge down the line. And then lastly, direct relationships. That's just going to be a list of who the client's tied to directly on the family tree. So right now, Lauren's the only other person on the family tree. So it's telling us that Ben is married to Lauren. And then we'll go ahead and save this information. So next, let's say I wanted to add a child. So whoever the blue circle is around is who you're adding to. And to get the blue circle around an icon, you just click once on their icon. If you double click, it's going to bring up more information. But if you click once, it just gets the blue circle around them. And then you go up to the add button and then you go child. And whenever you're adding a child, it's going to ask you who the other parent is. And you've got three options. So either it's the current spouse, it's a new parent, so it's an ex-spouse that's going to be involved in the will, or they're a single parent. So either they're genuinely a single parent or there's an ex-spouse that's not going to be involved in the will. Let's say that it's Lauren is the other parent. And then you just enter in the child's information. So let's say this is John Collins, he's male, date of birth, July 8th, 2000. And then the special circumstances section for anyone that's not the client is a place where you can note relationship difficulties, that kind of thing, which is good to have well documented in case there's going to be a challenge down the line. But the most important thing here for the generation of the will is this disability function. So if the individual is disabled, you're going to want to make sure that this is clicked off so that the system picks up on the fact that this individual is disabled. And if you're trying to do a Henson Trust later on, it's going to pick up on the fact that that's what you're trying to do, and it will draft that wording accordingly. So that's the key trigger right there, that disability function. And then we'll go and add. If you look at the add list, you might notice that there's no option for grandchildren or nieces and nephews, but there's still a way to get them on the family tree. You just have to do so with by doing direct relationships. So instead of adding a grandchild directly to Ben, what you have to do is add a child to Ben and then click on that child's icon, so the blue circles around them, and then add a child to the child. So let's say he's a single parent. And that's how you would get the grandchild in. So let's call her Lily Collins, female, and we'll just add her in. And same kind of thing for niece and nephew. You would click on the client, you'd add a sibling to the client, then you'd click on the siblings icon and add a child to the sibling. And that's how you get nieces and nephews in. If there's going to be anybody else involved in the will, in either a beneficiary or a trustee capacity, but they're not family, so either they're just not family or they're so distant, like second cousin, that you don't want to build the whole family tree out just to get to them, you can go to this other tab over here and add them in here so that their information's in the system. And later on, when you're appointing people or picking beneficiaries, you'll be able to select them from the drop-down list. So let's say Jordy's going to be a trustee later on. So we'll put Jordy Ayton. Let's say he's a friend. And then we'll just add him in. That way we'll be able to choose him later on. So that's sort of the people section. Does anyone have any questions so far? Nope. Okay, we'll keep going. So after people is assets. And you're always going to start with those general personal effects assets, just to remind you to gift them to someone in the will, so it triggers a special general personal effects clause. If you want, you can put in details, you can put in the value, but you don't have to. It's more of just a placeholder to remind you to gift it once we get to the scenarios section. For any other assets, you can add in all the assets that they have and values and really give them a sense of what the net value of their estate's looking like at this point in time. But for the will generation itself, the only assets that you need to add in are those that are going to be specific asset bequests or registered assets that you want changed or to do a new, either you want to confirm or do a new designation in the will. So you'd have to add those as assets here so that we'll be able to specifically get them in the scenario section. So let's just add a couple in. So when you're adding an asset, you just pick a type or a category and then a type within it. So here it's going to be financial. Let's say we're doing a bank account. So for any asset, really the key field is this asset name field, because that's going to be how the asset's referred to throughout the system and in the will if it's going to be a specific asset bequest. So usually I put all the identifying information in the asset name so that it's not just called bank account, but this one is the RBC bank account number, that number. So that way, if I'm adding in multiple bank accounts, they're not just all called bank account, and then I get confused which is which. I know that this is the RBC bank account, and then I can differentiate it from any others if I'm adding in other bank accounts. I can put a balance in. It's going to calculate that probate tax for me automatically according to whatever I've set the client's residency as. So today we set it as Ontario, so it's calculating it according to Ontario law. And let's say it's solely owned. So we'll just go ahead and add that in. So next, let's do a property. So we'll go real estate, we'll go home. Again, however you want it called, maybe it's the family home if there are multiple homes. The address field, if you're gifting this specifically in the will, this will also populate. So let's say it's 123 Anywhere Street. And you're putting in the value, again, that probate tax is going to calculate automatically for you. And then you have this mortgage / encumbrances field. So if you do have a value, if there is a mortgage on the property and you know the value of that mortgage, I would put it in this field right here because it has an effect on the probate tax and it's good to know sort of what asset this debt is associated with. So after assets, the next section is debts, and there's also an option to add a mortgage in there, But if you're adding it as a value in this field, don't add it as a separate debt in the debt section because it will double count it. So best practice is if there's a mortgage and it's associated with a specific property that you're adding in as an asset, just add it in as a value in this field and don't add it as a separate debt in the debt section. So that's just a key thing to remember about mortgages. And then let's say that this is actually owned jointly. So we're going to change it to joint and then just scroll down a little bit and click right on that add owner text. And it's going to bring up everybody you've added to the system, either on the family tree or in the other tab. And we're going to say Lauren, the spouse, is the joint owner. And we'll just go ahead and add. And because we linked them together at the beginning, this family home is now going to appear in Lauren's list of assets as well. So if we wanted to see that, we just switch over to her profile up here and you'd see that family home is in there and we don't have to add it again twice. So we'll go back to Ben and we'll add one more. Let's say we're going to do an RSP. So we'll just scroll down here and select. Again, however you want it identified as, just change the asset name. The beneficiary field, this is just whoever the current beneficiary is on the policy. It doesn't actually have any effect on the system or the will. It's just for information purposes here. So once we get to the scenario section, we'll be able to either confirm or do a new designation of that beneficiary. But this is just for information on the asset. If we're putting in a current value, let's say it's 100,000. The property tax always automatically calculates, but the income tax doesn't. And this is just due to the variability of different clients' tax brackets. And so what we usually do, if we're putting in income tax, we do an estimate of, if it's something like an RSP, we put in like 50% of that so that you're sort of showing at the highest possible income tax this asset could incur. And then if it was something like an asset with a capital gain, we would do like 25% of that gain, just so you're showing a client a rough value. But you don't have to include that, but if you do want the income tax to show, it's going to be a manual calculation. And then we'll just add that in. So that's sort of the assets section. Does anyone have any questions here? Nope. Okay.
Just a question.
Oh, do you have a question?
Yeah, it's about how you set the will to the font for the will and where those settings are.
Sure. So
I
that's
forgot
back
about.
on the documents tab. So to get back there, you would just go to clients and then on your just switch over to documents. And you have to do it for each one of these documents, but for the single will, you just click on that. And then everything at the bottom, so name options and document,
Oh, okay.
set your font and stuff here, then every single will would come out with this.
Okay.
Yep. So that's over on the documents tab, but let's go back into Ben and we'll go to debts. That's the next section. So for debts, it doesn't really have an effect on the will itself. It's more for planning. But you would just go to this add debt button and then see how there's a mortgage here. I wouldn't add the mortgage again here because it will double count it. So don't add the mortgage, but let's say there's a credit card debt. So you could just say credit card and then you could enter in the details of that debt. So we'll just say it's $5,000. We'll add that. So that's debts. Then the next section is scenarios. So this is where all of the planning is going to occur. And at most, you're going to plan for these 3 scenarios. So for each of these 3 scenarios, so that you're covering your bases no matter what happens. So you'd start with the plan for if the spouse is alive when the client's passed. Then you go to if the spouse and the client are gone, but there's kids or grandkids around. And then you'd go to sort of your ultimate disaster when everyone's gone. If we click on it, we can go through it manually and start from scratch. But today I'm going to show you how you would use an e-plan instead. So up in the top right is this little sort of lightning bolt. So if you click on it, it's going to list all of the e-plans we currently have available. And an e-plan is basically like a macro that goes through the system and plans for you. So it's going to create a plan for each of these scenarios, and it's going to plan some of the appointments as well. And even if this is not the exact plan you're trying to do, if you're dealing with a client file that's a typical situation, so everything to spouse, everything to kids, it's a great starting point so that you're not starting from scratch. So I'm going to look at these. One of these is spouse with younger children, a two distributions trust. So it's telling me that in the surviving spouse, everything's going to the spouse. In the descendants only, everything's going to the kids in this trust. And then in the no descendants, it's giving half to siblings, half to spouses' siblings. So I like some of this stuff, but I want to do something different for some of it. But I'm still going to run it, and then I'm just going to go in and make the changes that I want to make. So that way I'm not starting from scratch. So you just click on it, and then you click execute, and it's going to go through and plan the scenarios and the appointments. So now when I click on surviving spouse, I see that there's planning done, so I'm not starting from scratch anymore. So what the e-plan is going to do is going to look at your assets, and anything that's joint or designated is going to give to the spouse in this scenario. So it's given the RSP and the family home to the spouse. So it's showing us that these are falling outside of the estate here. Then in the initial gift section, it's going to gift those general personal effects to Lauren. So it's going to the spouse so that it generates that special general personal effects clause in the will. And then for the balance of the estate, what it did, we can see the details by clicking on the gray bar. It's showing us that it's going absolutely to Lauren 100%. There's no gift over because we're dealing with that in the second scenario. That is the gift over, so we don't need to put anything here. So this looks good. So everything to the spouse, I don't need to change anything in this scenario. So the e-plan did it for me. So now I'm just going to switch to the second scenario. So you can click on scenarios and you can go to descendants only. Probably not any joint designated assets. For initial gifts, it's gifted those general personal effects to the class of children. So let me show you how you would do this if we weren't using the e-plan. So for any specific asset bequests, you would just click on the asset over here and you drag and drop it over. And then you decide absolute or trust. For general personal effects, you can do absolute, even if they're underage children, because it will have some wording on leaving it to the trustee's discretion for division. And then you click on the beneficiaries line, and I could name the children specifically, or I can scroll down and pick the class of children. And then I can just add. So that's how you would do it manually. And then for the balance of the estate, I'm going to see what trust they've created. So the e-plan did a trust to the class of children, trustees the same as the executors, the duration to when the beneficiary reaches age 30. Well, let's say I don't want to do that. I want it to be to when they reach age 25 instead. So I'll just change that. And then I'm going to look at the staged lump sums. It's showing me that they have 50% at 25, but I'm going to change it to 21, they get 25%. So I made a couple of changes here. Then the gift over is first to beneficiaries issue, then if not to other class members, so the other children. So that looks good. And then I'll save. So I made some changes, but I didn't have to start from scratch. So the e-plan still saved me a lot of time. And since I made changes to this specific scenario, and I want those changes to be reflected in Lauren's will as well, I'm going to click on Lauren's name up in the top corner, and then I'm going to press sync. And what that's going to do is it's going to copy this descendants only scenario over to Lauren's profile as well. So all the planning will be the same in hers. The one key thing to note about syncing is it doesn't sync solely owned assets. And sometimes it sees the general personal effects as each of their own solely owned assets. So sometimes you have to gift the general personal effects for one spouse and then switch over to the other spouse's profile and gift their general personal effects as well. So that's the key thing. Everything else is going to copy over. So the residue breakdown, anything that's joint between the two, that will all copy. The only thing that doesn't is solely owned assets. So that's the second scenario. Then we go to no descendants. So you don't necessarily always plan this far, especially if you're dealing with a big family. So if you weren't, you could just press clear and I could get rid of what the E-plan did here. But let's say that I do have a plan for this scenario. I want to give 50% to Jordy and 50% to a charity. So I'm going to do it manually by creating segments and then gifts within those segments. So first I'll start by adding a segment. We'll call it segment 1 for 50%. So now I've created a 50% piece, but I have to specify the details. So what's happening with this 50%? And I do that by adding a gift. So I click add gift. I'm going to say it's absolute to Jordy. We'll put a gift over into his issue and then we'll add. So now I've dealt with 100% of this 50%. So I don't need to add any more gifts because I've already dealt with all of this 50%. But what I do need to do is go and deal with the other 50%. So to do that, you're going to click out on this grayed out segments button. That's going to bring you back to the main segments. And then I'm going to add a second segment for the other 50%. I'm going to add a gift. If it's a charity you've already added to the system, you can just scroll down your list and pick it. But if not, you just go to these 3 dots and click on new charity. Let's say the charity I'm giving it to is Epilepsy Toronto. If you have their CRA number in, you can just type it right on this line. So just ignore this ID field because it doesn't populate anything. So if you do have the CRA number and want it to be in the will, just put it on the line with the name. And then we'll add. And this says 100%. So this means 100% of the 50% segment. So we're not dividing up that 50% segment any further. So we don't need to change this to 50. We want it to be 100% of the 50%. And then we'll add. So now we've dealt with this 50%, and so we've dealt with everything. And if we wanted to copy it over to Lauren, we could just click on Lauren's name and we'll sync this over to hers as well. So that's how scenarios works. Does anyone have any questions about the scenarios section? Nope. Okay. So after scenarios, we get to appointments. And this is where you're going to put in your state trustees and your guardians if you have those. So because we ran the E-plan, it's going to put the spouse as the primary appointee. And to add others, we would just go to the add button. You click right on appointee and you pick whoever your other appointee is. So let's say Jordy. And then the condition sort of makes them either a primary or an alternate. So if they're going to be another primary, so a joint primary with Lauren, you're going to select none. So anytime you want to make them a primary, set the condition as none. And anytime you want to make them an alternate, you can set a specific condition. Usually I say if all specified cannot act, and then I make sure that specified line is right. So it's right because it's Lauren. So it's saying, Lauren, if Lauren can't act, then Jordy. If I wanted to do a further alternate, I could pick John, then I just set the condition. And if I wanted it to be joint with Jordy, I would keep the specified as Lauren. But if I want him to be a further alternate, I just change the specified to Jordy so that it's going to be Lauren. If Lauren can't act, Jordy. If Jordy can't act, John. And then the sync button for scenarios or for appointments, sorry, is in the bottom left. So you're just going to click on Lauren's name here and sync it over. And then the last thing we're going to go into today is provisions. So there's a couple things here. The first is funeral arrangements. So if you want those to populate in the will, you can just type them on the line. But if not, just highlight the text and delete it, and there won't be a body disposition clause in the will. Include future members. This is if you're doing class gifts like we did in the will, and we want to leave it open to future members of the class. So if I click this box, it's going to say my children are John and any other child born to me and Lauren. If I don't want it, if I just want it to be John, then I can uncheck that. Same kind of thing for class restrictions. Then your trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. This is your general trust clause. So it's not going to affect any trust that you've set up in the will, but it's going to govern underage beneficiaries that you haven't set up specific trusts for. So if it goes through a gift over to a grandchild or something like that, it will follow this trust. So you can change the duration or you can leave it at 25. And then the last thing is secondary will assets. So if you're doing multiple wills, so if you're doing primary and secondary corporate wills, then you can pick and choose here which definitions you want included in the secondary will. So you just check the ones that you wanted included. And then if you're doing a single will, you can just leave it. You don't have to check or uncheck anything. It won't affect the single will. So that's provisions. And then up in the top corner, this little exclamation point, these are what we call advisor insights. So it's basically like contextual advice, almost like a checklist that you can go through to make sure you haven't missed anything when you're planning. So it's going to advise you on things you might have missed putting in the system, like I didn't put in Lauren's residency or her gender. So I can go back and change that and these alerts will go away. But not everything is going to go away. So some things are always there, like this request prior wills and powers of attorney. And you don't need to get rid of these before you generate. So it has no effect on the generation. It's just for your knowledge to be sure that you've gone through these things so you can be more confident that you haven't missed anything. The thing beside it is just notes. So if you wanted to make any notes on your client, you could do so here. Maybe you wanted to note that you had done a title search on a property, or you wanted to ask about the spelling of a name, you could just type in that note field right there. And these notes do appear at the end of the text summary. So if you're giving that text summary to clients, just be aware of what kind of notes you put in. And then the last button, this is where you go to generate all your documents and your summaries. So first, there are 3 summaries you can generate. So the profile one, it's going to give you all the information that the clients filled out in their questionnaire or that you've filled out for them, like we did today. So it's going to give you all of their profile information, family tree, assets, and debt. So it's just got all of that data. So it's good for your file. And you can also give it to the client so that they can check everything over and make sure that they haven't missed anything or that there's not an incorrect asset or spelling of a name before you do the final draft of the will. Then you've got the graphic scenario summary. So it's going to give you a nice visual representation of the will for each of the scenarios. So it's almost like a funnel. So you have all your assets at the top and it funnels into the balance of the estate at the bottom. Then you've got your last one, your text scenario summary. And it's going to give you all the data of everything that you've done in the will. So who your trustees are, how you've divided up each scenario, what initial gifts you created. It's like the will without the legalese. It's just got all of the details. So it's really helpful for the client's understanding of their plan. So those are the 3 summaries. And then you go to documents. So if you're on a trial, you can ignore this message, but if you're on the flex plan, this is going to come up whenever you go to generate your first document or summary for the client, because that's the trigger for when you're charged for that client. So you can say continue, you can ignore it if you're on a trial. And then these are all the documents you can generate. So today we're doing a single will. For the signing date, you can change it. You can take it out completely and you can manually put it in the will later. Registered asset designation, that's if you want the registered assets to be confirmed or to do a new designation in the will. Joint designated asset confirmation, that's if there are any assets that are joint. Maybe your client has a lot of assets that are joint with adult children and you want something that says anything that's joint is truly intended to be joint, not held on a resulting trust. Counterpart is if you're signing in counterpart under the new legislation. Simplified provisions is a shorter will with less definitions and powers. The will guide is a nice chart at the end that sort of guides the clients to the clauses in the will. And a cover page is just a cover page. And then for witnesses, you can pick anyone else who's a user on your account, or you can click this blank box and you can manually put their information in the will. And then you just click on generate, and it's going to give you a Word document of everything that you put in the system. It's going to create a will for you. And if you had done that document customization, then it's going to come out in the font that you like. So I'll just go through it quickly. So the funds and plans, this is if you click the registered asset box. Assets passing outside of the will is if you click the joint asset box. Then you've got some definitions. Here the children means John and any other child born to, because we click that future children box. Here's our executors. So we've Lauren, if not Lauren, then Jordy. Then we have our funeral arrangements. Here's our special personal effects clause that gets generated because we gifted the general personal effects in the initial gift section. So you're going to see this red highlighting here because whenever you gift the general personal effects to children, it's going to ask you whether you want the division of those personal effects to be up to the trustee's discretion. If it is, you can take out, or ABC, you can take out all those. Or if you want to implement some sort of lottery system or something like that, so you can keep them. So it's just highlighted so it draws your attention so you can make a decision in the will. Then here's the residue. So to Lauren, not to Lauren, then to the children in this trust. And then lastly, half to Jordy, half to Epilepsy Toronto. And then if we go all the way down, it's going to give us our will guide. So that's the guide to all the clauses in the will. And that's sort of how you would go through it. Then you would ideally switch over to Lauren's, go through hers, make sure she's not missing anything, and then you would generate her will as well. And if you ever get stuck, you can click on this little question mark up in the top corner, and it's going to bring you right over to our help desk. So you can search for lots of things and articles on how to do things. It's going to give you a step-by-step. Some of them have pictures. So it can be a really helpful resource if you're ever stuck. Or you can always email me your support, and we're happy to help as well. So before I wrap up, does anyone have any final questions?
Are you allowed
Yes,
to
no.
generate as many
Sure.
wills as you want for a particular client? Like if you generate one, you don't like it, can you generate another one until you're happy with it?
Yep. So once you've triggered that fee, if you're on the unlimited plan, you can generate as many, but once you've triggered that fee, you can generate as many wills for that client, as many different documents for that client as you want.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I wanted to ask, when adding specific clauses associated with the practice, we've experienced a lot of formatting issues. So maybe if you could give us an example of you trying to add a particular clause, for example, and see how that works on your document.
So I know that it's really not set up to be changing a lot in the actual document itself. So you can, it's a Word document, you can put in your own clauses, but I know that sometimes people run into formatting issues, which is why we're working on sort of a big feature release that will allow you to customize your documents. So that's sort of the goal in the future. But for now, I'm not really sure what to say other than like, do you tend to be sort of changing a lot in the actual will itself to put in your own clauses? Is it because our precedents don't have those clauses that you're looking for, or you're just finding that you like your own better?
Well, my boss really prefers to have her own specific ones that she has drafted. So that's our case scenario.
Right. So yeah, so that's what we're working on in the future, for you to be able to customize your own precedents. But for now, you kind of have to work around using ours and reformatting.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions?
There was just a quick question, Michaela, on if you just did a scenario for you're not doing husband and wife wills, and if you do the spouse, a gift, you gift to the spouse personal effects, but then if she's not surviving, in that scenario, you have to deal with all the personal effects again, right? It's the, it's,
So if you want, so you don't have to give the general personal effects, but if you want them to populate in the will, then you'd have to give them in more than one scenario. So I would give them usually to the spouse in the first scenario and then the children in the second. But you don't have to. It would just fall into the residue if you didn't. But
okay, yeah,
yeah,
I see what you mean. It's more specific if you put it in
exactly.
in
So
the
it'll
second.
specifically list it as a clause if you put it in the will and
Okay,
then gifts, but otherwise you don't have to. It just won't generate that special
yeah.
clause.
Where was that clause you showed me about, it was a trust for the, like the, it was a residence trust. The,
Sure. So that would be in the initial gift section too. So depending on which scenario, let's go to the second one. So you would just click on the initial gift over and you drag and drop it. And then you'd click on trust. And then you'd pick whoever your beneficiary was and you'd go through and set the termination, your expense breakdown. You've got a bunch of different things you can do with the residence trust.
okay, that's it. That's a very helpful part because, just knowing that there's two different types of gifts kind of is helpful for some clients because they don't realize that if I give the gift outright to my partner and expect her to give it when she dies, give it to, you know, the initial client's children. Let's say it's it's a second partnership, and he has two children that he wants to leave it to after his wife is, after his girlfriend, I guess, is finished using it. And how long would she be allowed to live in it? That was a question that I had, like, what's reasonable for, a surviving spouse to live in the house, and then before it goes back to, before it falls out of the trust and into the gift over children, like the two children that the initial client had. So I had Darren, he has a girlfriend, and he wants her to live in the house, but he doesn't want to leave it to her absolutely because he can't trust her to leave it to his two kids because she could change the will.
Mm-hmm.
So he wants to put it into a trust and then leave it to his children after she's finished with it. So that was the,
Yeah, so that's the good thing about lots of customizability here. So you could leave it to the spouse. You could set the termination of all of these different things. So if you want certain the age of the beneficiary, or you can
okay.
set conditions as well. So allow the children to occupy, or you can type in whatever. You can get really specific with it. So
Okay.
that can kind of work well that way.
All right.
Michaela, I have a question. My name is Joy.
Hi, I could barely hear you.
Hi, can you hear me now?
A little bit.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. It's a quick question. How about I want to, my client wants to appoint a foreigner who's not a Canadian and who lives outside of Canada, and that's a relative who he or she can only trust to take care of the legacy. So is that any terms or any clauses take care of that?
Sorry, I can barely hear you.
Oh, okay. Okay,
Just
I'll
coming
email
from
you
a
later.
muffle.
Okay. Hello? I can email you later. Sorry about
Okay,
that.
sure. Any other final questions? No? Okay, well, if you do ever get stuck on anything, don't hesitate to reach out. But thanks again for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.